Hi guys, welcome back to Chess the Matthew. So on this video, we'll tackle about the game between Magnus Carlsen versus Aryan Tari on the FIDE World Cup 2023. So we are now on the game 3 to the chess journey of Magnus Carlsen on the FIDE World Cup 2023. And here Magnus Carlsen is playing white and Aryan Tari here is black. And their opening battlefield goes with the moves of d4, knight f6, c4, e6, and after the move knight c3, here comes now the Nimzo-Indian chess opening. So here, Magnus Carlsen chooses the variation of e3, trying to solidify his center on the dark square, and again, opening up some lines for his light-scored bishop on the board. But here, Aryan Tari here just simply castle on the king side, and after king side castling, Magnus Carlsen here plays bishop to d2, and here Aryan Tari tries the move c5 on the board. So going back on this position after bishop to d2, Aryan Tari here can actually try another fifth move, which is the b6. And for example, after Magnus Carlsen here tries a3, for example, after bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3, knight to e4, attacking the bishop on the c3 and try to double the c-pawn on this position. And if the white plays, for example, queen to c2, attacking this knight, but there's just a sample knight takes to c3, and after queen takes c3, the black here can immediately place bishop b7 on this position, stopping any further development of the light square of the white here on this position, because this bishop is actually obliged to defend his g2 pawn from the attack of bishop to b7 of black. And here, for example, the white here can simply develop first his knight to e2, trying to reroute this knight to g3 and after f3, so that later on the white here can move now his bishop to e2 after playing f3 in this position. For example, after d6 on this position for black, and after knight g3, f5, f3, so that this bishop can develop now. And after queen to g5 with pressure to the king side and also to the e3 square. But after bishop to e2, the black here has a smooth game. For example, after knight d2, king side castling, and knight to f6 on this position, with inactive pieces for the black and with a fully control to the light square on the board. So after bishop to d2, Aryan Tari here simply plays c5 on this position, trying to have tension on the center. But here Magnus Carlsen just play a3, trying to force this bishop to capture now the knight on c3. For example, after bishop takes c3, bishop takes c3. Again, Aryan Tari here plays knight to e4, attacking the bishop. And after, for example, knight to e2, stopping any double pawns on the c file because of the knight that defends the c3. And after, for example, b6, here comes now the d5 move, and Aryan Tari here plays bishop to a6. The difference, for example, on this position, going back, for example, after this fifth move of black, is that after, for example, some couple of moves, after, for example, knight takes c3, queen takes, bishop b7, knight moves, pawn, f5, and, for example, after f3 and queen g5, bishop e2, and knight e7, is that the white here is actually restricted. For example, after king side castling and knight f6, the white here is actually restricted to have some space advantage by playing the move d5, because the d5 now was actually has many defense, for example, with the knight, the pawn, and the bishop. But for example, going back, for example, on this position after bishop to a6, although the black here can play another knight move with bishop b7, but after, for example, f3 for white, and knight takes, and e takes on this position, after c takes d5, d6, and bishop to d3, we shall see on this position now that the white here actually win some space on the board with this pawn on d5, because it actually controls now the e6, the c6, and this knight with an attack to the b5 square and g5. So we shall see in this position now that the white here has a slight advantage with a space advantage on the board. So for example, after bishop to a6, in which Tari here chooses to play, Magnus Carlsen here just play f3 on this position, trying to attack the knight, because for example, after knight takes c3, knight takes c3, although the white here can win a pawn on the c4 after bishop takes c4, because after bishop takes c4, there is just a simple queen h4 check with double attack on the c4 bishop. So after the white here defend with g3, Aryan Tari here grabbed now the bishop, and Magnus Carlsen here simply plays the move h4. The idea behind this h4 move is that although the white here has a pawn advantage, but after e takes d5 for black, there is just a simple knight takes d5 on this position, and again, Aryan Tari here plays knight c6, and after b3, here comes now the idea of Magnus Carlsen, in which Aryan Tari here was forced to play b5 or even a6, but after, for example, he played queen a6, there is knight c7, a fork on the board. So going back, for example, after h4, Aryan Tari here can actually tries another move and plays queen a6 instead of e takes d5 on the board, because after queen to a6, there is just a simple queen to e2, trying to have some queen trade, but the black here can simply retreat his queen to b7, because after kingside castling on the board, there's just simple e takes d5, rook takes d5, and after knight c6 and rook h to d1 and rook a to d8. Although the white here is actually a pawn down, but with an active piece on the board, it actually compensates for a sacrifice pawn, and still in this position, it is actually a drawish. So after h4, Aryan Tari here chooses e takes d5, although it allows here a knight fork, for example, this position after knight takes d5, in which Aryan Tari here just simply plays knight c6, b3, attacking the queen, queen e3, and knight c7. Still, the valuation on the board is actually equal. For example, after queen to a5 check, because after b4 and after c takes b4, c takes b4, knight takes a8, and pawn takes a3, the valuation on the board is actually equal because of the fact that after queen to d2, rook takes to a8, and after queen takes a5 and knight takes e5 and rook takes a3, although the black here has only the knight and the pawn is actually equal to a rook. So going back, for example, after rook takes to a8, after queen to d2, Aryan Tari here should play queen to c5 to force an equality, because, for example, after knight to c7, knight e5 attacking the pawn with a threat to fork, and after knight a6 attacking the queen, but there's the simple knight takes f3 check, king moves, knight takes c5, pawn takes c5, rook takes a3, knight c4, and after, for example, rook takes e7 and knight e5, although the material here is actually even, and the knight and 2 pawns is actually equal to a rook. So the only difference, for example, after rook takes a8 and queen takes a5, knight takes e5, rook takes a3, knight c4, in which, for example, Magnus Carlsen here forced to win the e7, for example, after rook a6, knight takes e3, king moves, attacking the knight, knight d5, rook h to a1, and after king f8, rook takes, and king to e7, is that, for example, after 27th move, after Magnus Carlsen here captured the pawn on a7, is that if we go back, for example, on this position, after the white here should play queen to c5, is that after knight c7, knight moves, knight a6, knight takes, king moves, knight takes, pawn takes, rook takes, and after knight c4 and rook takes e7, is that after knight e5, it is actually a radical equality without any weaknesses on the endgame for the black perspective, because these 2 pawns is actually connected on this position, rather than, for example, after the moves queen to d2, rook takes e8, queen takes, knight takes, rook takes, and after the moves, for example, after Magnus Carlsen here actually win the a7, and after this position, after rook takes a7, is that these 2 pawns is actually not connected, and on the endgame, it is the liability for the black here to defend more effort on this position. So after Magnus Carlsen here grab the pawn on this position after rook takes e7, Aryan Tari here play the move king to e7, trying to put his king into the center, and after rook b7, trying to have some pressure on these disconnected pawns, and Aryan Tari here play h5 on this position, trying to win some space advantage on the king side, but it is actually an inaccurate. Aryan Tari here should play f5 because of the fact, for example, after g4, there is the simple f takes, and after f takes g4 and h6, we shall see on this position now that the white king will be out on this center to defend, for example, the pawns, or tries to have some pass pawn, because these two connected pawns is actually outside pass pawn, and it actually puts on the fact that this king of white and rook, for the white perspective, will be always be disconnected, because the duty of this rook will always defend this pawn to stop it from promoting on the b file, while this king will be busy also on defending on the king side against these h and g pawns of black. So going back, for example, after rook b7, in which Aryan Tari here actually just played the move h5, and after g4, Aryan Tari here plays g6, rook b8, and after king to d6 and king c3. Although it is actually okay for black on this position, in which after king to g3 of white, it is actually evaluated as drawish. But after on this position, Magnus Carlsen here should play rook f8 and tries to pressure the f pawn of the black, because for example after f6, rook b8, f5, king moves, h takes, pawn takes, e6, trying to defend his king side. But there is just simple rook to a8 check, king f6, g5 check, and after king to f7, there is simple rook to d8, again pressurizing this independent pawn. And for example, if the black defend, but again the rook can go another square to rook h8 and tries to have a pass pawn on this position. For example, after b5, rook h6, trying to win the pawn, and after king f7, h5, pawn takes, but there is a simple rook to d6 with a fork, and we shall see in this position now that this 3 unconnected is actually a liability for the black's position. So here, for example, after king to d6, in which Magnus Carlsen here plays again an inaccurate move with king to g3, in which he should play rook f8 to force a win on this position. So after king g3, f5 for Aryan Tari. This is again another bad move on this position. The black here should play king to c5 and to help this pawn to be promoted on the b file with his king and knight. For example, after rook c8 on this position with a check, there's just simple king d4, and after rook b8, queen c5, rook c8 with a perpetual move on the position will actually leads to a draw. So for example, after king to c5, if the white here force this position with g takes h5, but after g takes h5 and after rook h8, there's just simple b5. The idea here is, for example, after rook takes, this pawn on b5 is actually unstoppable to promote on the b file, because of the fact that after b4, rook h8, b3, rook b8, knight b4, covering the file, and after, for example, rook to e8, b2, rook to e1, king to c4, rook to b1, and after king to b3, defending his pass pawn, and after f4, trying to win these pawns and try to promote this pass pawn of white, but there's the simple knight e5 check, and after king to e5, knight e7, and after king f6, knight g5 check, and again it actually still leads to a draw on this position with triple repetition moves on the board. So after f5, the evaluation of the board actually favors for white. The last chance here for Aryan Tari here is to play his 31st move with king to c5 and to force the position to a draw, instead of playing f5, which is actually favors for white, because after g takes h5, g takes h5 and rook h8, and after f4, Aryan Tari giving a check, but after king f2, again the valuation of the board doesn't change, and it's still it favors to the white's perspective. So for example, after f4, even though he tries b5 on this position, but there's just a simple rook takes, because after b4, rook h8, king to c6, h5, b3, rook b8, f4 check, and after king h3, knight b6, trying to cover the file. But again, the rook here was actually on time to stop the b pawn to promote, because after rook to a8, e2, rook to e1, and again this rook prevents this pawn to promote on b1, and while this pawn will slowly go down to the board and promote it into queen, and with a huge winning chances on the board. So going back after f4 with a check, Magnus Carlsen here play king f2, and after knight f6, defending king to e2, putting his king into the center, and after king to a5, king to d3, d6, rook h6. Again, just a matter of technique. Magnus Carlsen here has actually a huge winning chances on the in-game because his rook here in his position was actually active, and again his king is actually on the center to stop the pawns, while this rook, his duty is to try to distract this knight, and if this knight will be out of defense, then his pawns will actually falls down. So after d5, rook to g6, b5, rook g5 check, king to e6, king to c3. Again, this king, his duty is to prevent this pawn to be advanced and tries to pick it up if it is not actually defended. And again, this rook will go to this another way on the king side and tries to wait. For example, if the knight will be moved, then the h5 will lose its defense. So for example, after knight d7, Magnus Carlsen here just played king to d4 to stop any c5 move, and e5, and for example after knight f6, rook to g7, b4, rook to a7, the rook goes another way to give a check, and again tries to win these undefended pawns on the queen side. And after knight to g8, rook e6 check, king f5. Again, Magnus Carlsen here win now the pawn on the d5, and after b3, rook b6, keeping an eye to this pass pawn, and after for example knight a7 check, king moves, trying to win this pawn now, and after the move knight g6 on the board, Magnus Carlsen here sacrifices rook to force the endgame to be favorable for him after rook takes g6, because after king takes g6 and king takes b3, Aryan Tari here actually resigned because this endgame is actually favorable for the white pieces. So after 49 moves, Aryan Tari here resign and Magnus Carlsen here wins. So for example, if we continue, for example, if we play f5, but we shall see in this position now that the white here is actually on the opposition, for example, against this king. Because after king to c3, although he can try king to e5 to get some opposition to the king, but after king to c4, this black king cannot go to e4 to go for the opposition because there is a pawn. So after king to d6, king to d4, the white here is on time to the opposition against the king, and after king to e7, king to e5, and again later on the white here will manage to win these pawns because this king was out of the defense. So for example, after queen takes b3, and if you try the king f6, again trying to have some opposition, for example with queen c3 and after king to e5, but still there is king to c4. As like I said, there is no king to e5 to go with the opposition because there is a pawn. So after king to e6, going to the opposition, but after king to d4, king f5, and king to d5, again the white here is on time to the opposition against this black king, and after the king will move to king to g6, but there is the simple king to e4, and again this pawn has no defense. This king cannot go this square because there is a pawn, and again the white here is actually winning on the in-game. So going back, for example, after d4, knight f6, c4, e6, knight c3, and bishop b4, the Nimzo-Indian defense. But after e3, e4, although they actually have an equality on the opening, even though, for example, in this position, even though the black here actually didn't play the immediate b6 on the fifth move, but for example after knight to e4, although the white here wins a space on the d5, but Aryan Tari here managed to win a pawn on the c4, but after g3 and after a couple of moves, for example on this position, Magnus Carlsen here managed to fork the rook and queen, and after on this position, although it is actually balanced after these moves, after this position with rook on a7 and the knight and the pawns, but for some improvement, for example after queen to d2, Aryan Tari here should play rook c5 first before capturing the knight on a8, because after queen to c5, knight c7, and again knight e5 with a fork, and after some couple of moves and have a couple some exchanges, we shall see on this position now that the black here is better with two connected pass pawns and with a knight against this rook, and it is actually evaluated as equal. So I hope you enjoyed this video, and please don't forget to subscribe.